Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for joining us at Afterwards today, and congratulations on what's quite an achievement.
Thank you.
I really, first of all, to start the interview off saying I really enjoyed the book.
Thanks.
It read like a novel. I mean, it really read like nonfiction in places, which I'm sure that as the writer you encountered some of that feeling as well. And I know as a reporter who's dealt with ExxonMobil a good chunk of her career, how difficult it probably was to probe this company. So let's kind of start there. Why ExxonMobil? How did you come to this subject? I mean, I know that you looked at Getty Oil previously in your career, but why this company, and how was it? How did it differ from some of your other subjects like the Bin Ladens?
It's an interesting. To me, it was an interesting journey because, as you point out, I mean, I started out as a business reporter on Wall Street when I was very young, and then I went abroad and worked more on international subjects. And after 9/11, I wrote about the origins of the 9/11 attacks in 20 years of American covert policy in Afghanistan in this book, Ghost Wars. And then after that was over, I thought, I want to keep writing about America and the world after 9/11, this sort of asymmetric, strange groping that we had as a country to understand what the attacks were about, what they meant for the United States, what our relationship with the Middle East was. And that led me to the Bin Ladens, which was a book intended to be about Saudi Arabia and its modernization and how complicated it was for this generation of oil shock boomers that Osama belonged to come of age in the 70s when the kingdom was just awash in wealth, and they had to all go out and buy identities in the world, and one of them became a notorious terrorist, and the others all moved to Florida and so forth. And so that interested me, and when I was finished with that project, I really wanted to write about oil and American power in the post-9/11 context. And so I started out, actually, the project didn't begin as a book about ExxonMobil, it began as a book about oil and geopolitics. I wanted to essentially take the prize, the book by Dan Yergin that had inspired me as a young man a long time ago, and update it. I sort of thought of the prize as a great work of nonfiction about the era of oil that was an era of expansion and discovery. And what I wanted to do was to write a book about global oil in the era of limits and constraints and climate and the rest of it. And so I started out on that kind of open framework, and I got about 6-8 months into the research, and I thought to myself, I really need a subject here. I need a company. And once I came to that conclusion, then for an American audience, I thought ExxonMobil was the only choice. So I sort of backed into them as a subject, and I didn't quite realize what I was getting into when they were sort of forced upon me, at least in my thinking, as a subject, because I didn't know how closed they were, how difficult they were to report on. I just thought they would be a normal corporation. And I also didn't understand that much about their distinctive internal culture. So a lot of the 3.5 years that remained was about discovering what ExxonMobil really was.
And during the course of this reporting, the BP Deepwater Horizon spill happened. At all, were you at that point like, maybe I picked the wrong company?
Well, it's very interesting. Well, I had mixed feelings. I joked to my journalist friends, there must be a word in German like Schadenfreude that describes what journalists feel when other people suffer but you get an ending to your book. And I thought, well, this spill, the catastrophe of an environmental disaster on that scale, even though it wasn't ExxonMobil's responsibility, it did provide a kind of contextual bookend for the Valdez spill, which is a sort of origin story for modern ExxonMobil. It's a story they tell themselves. They tell themselves the story that they were scared straight by the Valdez and that they reformed themselves, and a lot of who they are traces to the reforms that started with that accident. So I thought, well, the Deepwater Horizon accident could be a bookend. At one stage when I was wrestling with how to make the book more specific, I did consider a dual narrative of ExxonMobil and BP, and my regret at Deepwater Horizon was, oh, maybe I should have done that. But looking back on it, it would have been too much reporting. I would never have gotten underneath the surface if I hadn't concentrated on one corporation.
So let's talk about that, because that's really an interesting point. I mean, starting the book out with Valdez, and to be honest, making it new. I just, some of your narrative, I thought, made it new. And then ending with the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in April 2010. As a person that really delved into, I know you read a lot of the transcripts from the Exxon Valdez incident. Did you see any parallels? Because I did a little bit. As a reporter, I didn't cover Valdez. I was a young man. I did cover Deepwater Horizon, and in your description of Valdez and Exxon's response to it, I did see some. It almost seems like BP took a page a little bit out of their playbook. Yeah. Did you see that at all as you were seeing the coverage of BP?
Definitely, there were definitely parallels. I'm a couple. You could probably list even more than come to my mind, but a few that come to mind are that in the decade running up to Valdez, there were warning signs that Exxon was not operating in a consistent manner, in a way that would give you the highest possible reassurance that such a catastrophic accident could not take place. In fact, in the decade before the Valdez, Exxon cut 80,000 out of 180,000 employees. They reorganized their entire safety department, their entire environmental department, and obviously the fact that a tanker captain with a drinking problem who had DUI arrests was still in his job making more than $100,000 a year in 1989 dollars. That's not the ExxonMobil you would expect today. So there was a series of warning signs that culminated in the accident. The same was true at BP. I mean, I don't know what you would say, but I had the impression from people in the industry that BP's record as a weak operator, and the Texas City plant, the OSHA record, the fact that they basically had a culture and a strategy that emphasized financial engineering at the expense of operating discipline was pretty well known in the industry. And I sort of came to the conclusion after talking to people for 3 or 4 years that if you had called up people in the oil industry on the morning of Deepwater Horizon and said to them, the following thing has happened, who do you think the supermajor is that was operating that platform, that you would have gotten a strong majority for BP at that point. So that was there. The second parallel was the preparation for actually mitigating the disaster. In both cases, there were a lot of paper plans saying we can handle this, and then the reality was they were not in position to do so.
Right.
And then the kind of public relations narrative and learning how to deal with all of the communities and traumas. I think probably BP had the benefit of 20 years of learning about corporate crisis management that Exxon, in those days, 89, this whole philosophy of how you communicate and immediately go up on television telling people you're going to make things right and so forth, that wasn't as well developed as a strategy in Exxon's day. But anyway.
No, I agree. I think the aftermath strikes me more than what happened before both of the disasters, in terms of, as a reporter after the Deepwater Horizon, I mean, BP had gobbled up like every expert on any kind of, you couldn't find a blowout preventer expert to save your life.
Right.
That wasn't on BP's payroll.
Right.
And there was that, I think the control that emanates through this book.
That's a good point.
I think emanated after BP in terms of kind of controlling the message, controlling access to people that could independently talk to reporters about what happened, and very technical subject again.
Right.
So you go everywhere in this book. I mean, you globe-trot in the true sense of the word. And you also tackle numerous environmental issues, from global warming to obviously the spill at sea at a tanker to leaky underground storage tanks. LUS is what the EPA calls them, and MTBE, which I covered in my early career in upstate New York, to the risk of phthalates, all which have connections to this oil company because it's integrated and controls oil from cradle to grave. How did you pick out the anecdotes? And this is a company that goes back to Standard Oil days. There's a treasure trove, and as a reporter, I know it's difficult to use that sifter and which nuggets you're going to pick. Yeah. So how did you pick out the anecdotes for this book?
Yeah, so I started out with a map. Once I chose ExxonMobil as the subject, I basically looked at the map of where they own oil and gas. And I just basically asked myself as a reporter, well, what kind of world is this? Why are they there? Why are they there? And then I became interested in traveling across that map because, as you pointed out earlier, they're a closed subject. They were not excited to learn that I was doing this book. They didn't volunteer to be written about. They handled my inquiries in a professional way, but they didn't really cooperate very much. I think maybe they would say that relative to some projects, they cooperated more than usual, but from the perspective of the ambition of the book, while it was helpful, everything that they offered, it was pretty limited. So I basically had to go outside in. And so once I started with this outside-in process, I started with the map. And so the first year I traveled a fair amount out into the field where